now. Hi, and welcome to the Australian Azure User Group for April 2021. Not much, Nick. Well done. Thanks for the slideshow.
Excellent.
Welcome. Nick, do you want to just explain what's going on today to our viewers?
Yeah, absolutely, Stu. Thanks very much. It's impressive that all three of us, no one actually picked up on the March-April thing. I'm quite impressed. So for today we've got an interesting session. We're going to do some introductions of who's speaking here today. We've got some news and tools, so some other cool things that have come out from Build and some tools that we think you should be aware of. We're going to have a discussion around leveling up your on-prem career to the cloud. So we've got Gareth here who's going to talk about his experience, and Stu and I are going to share our experiences. We'd love if you're signed into YouTube and you want to ask us any questions, put that in the comment and we'll cover that as well. So then we'll run through your questions, and then we'll have a bit of a prizes giveaway of some good questions. We've got some Azure passes there. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, and of which we're meeting, and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I would also like to extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. So who have we got here today? We've got Gareth James. So Gareth joins us from Microsoft Consulting Services, and he's a principal consultant there. And then myself, Nick Price, Applications and Infrastructure Cloud Solution Architect. And Stu, do you want to give yourself an intro, Stu, who is also an Applications Cloud Solution Architect there?
Absolute DevOps, my passions.
I'm DevOps, yeah, okay. Excellent. So some community meetup news. We are looking for contributors. So if anyone else wants to come and help make this a bit more professional, maybe you'll be the one that realizes that we wrote March instead of April on the front page. Please come and please introduce yourself on LinkedIn and come and join the party and be a part of setting this up. So we're also looking for other speakers and other topics as well. So you can open a Git issue on our repo, or you can drop us an email or a LinkedIn message, and we can go from there. And I feel a bit dirty saying this, but if you could please like and subscribe our YouTube channel, that would be very helpful for us. Thank you.
I'm proud to do this, Nick. Like and subscribe.
Thanks. That's fantastic, Stu.
Think that's hilarious.
You're like a dirty content creator, Nick.
I'm just trying my best. That's all. So what have we got? Upcoming events. We've got Microsoft Build coming, which is quite exciting for those of us in the developer persuasion. So there'll be, if you're a beginner developer like me, or you're an experienced computer programmer like Stuart, there's going to be something for everyone on there. The sign-up page is not yet open, but will be soon at mybuild.microsoft.com. So we've got this great tweet from Donovan, who works for Microsoft, realizing that his face was used on the events page for Microsoft Build, which is pretty funny. So some recent news, something if you're a networking person that you'd be quite excited about is the fact that you can now use service tags for user-defined routes. So you can have a user-defined route that goes to Active Directory, or one that goes to a particular region. You don't have to go and put all those routes in there manually, which I think is long overdue, but really excited that is going to be here now. Azure Active Directory B2C, or external identities. The public preview for that is now in the AU region. So if you select Australian data, if you select Australia when you're creating a new B2C tenant, that will end up in the Sydney and Melbourne regions. And the other B2C announcement was that custom domains are now available via Azure Front Door as well. So that's super cool. One other thing we thought pertinent was the Start on VM Connect feature has just sort of landed in public preview for Windows Virtual Desktop, so you don't actually have to have your machines running until your users connect to them now with that functionality in WVD, which is pretty cool. I'll pass on to Stu for some of the other things here.
Yeah, and as always, I had difficulty choosing these because there's so many. It's like choosing one of your kids to be your favorite. But whole heap of these. So, like, private link for Redis is now generally available, and that'll open up a whole bunch of cheaper workload scenarios for people using Redis really lightly. I think that's a great opportunity for people. Dynamic data masking, security is key for the Azure products. And so you can granular permissions on that data masking. We can share these links afterwards. Forecasted cost alerts, which is something that I think a lot of people are nervous about with the cloud. How do I manage my spend? So that's one of the features that's gone generally available. Azure App Insights and Log Analytics are now in AU Central 2. Durable functions, which is kind of your Azure functions running as a long-running workflow, now support Python, which is cool for all my data science friends who are fanatical about Python. And anybody just getting started in IT, my kids learn Python at school. And Azure Cosmos DB now has continuous backup with point-of-time restore, which is really cool because that's a fully managed database for you, and you can get on with building your workloads and shipping it rather than dealing with the database, really, which is the boring stuff in my view as an apps guy.
A Cosmos DB enthusiast, I think we call you around here, don't we? Cool. That's right. So this is a new section that we're going to add to this format. So this is called Awesome Tools. So we encourage you, if you find some awesome tools, please let us know, and we're happy to showcase them here. If you're writing an awesome tool, then you want it showcased here, absolutely. So here's just a few that we found. So AzGovViz, which is the Azure Governance Visualizer. This is a really cool tool. This is written by a customer engineer in Germany, Julian Haywood. So shout out to him. And it will interrogate all of your Azure governance models, so your management groups, your subscriptions, your role assignments, your policy sets, everything else. And it can actually produce like a quite useful interactive clickable HTML report. So this will give you a snapshot of a point in time of how all these things were set. So there's some instructions on his repo there about setting that up as part of a pipeline process, so that you could say that you always have a report every time something is deployed, so that you've always got that governance snapshot either before or after, which I think is really cool and might help that anyone with compliance or regulatory requirements around that sort of stuff. So it's also useful if you've maybe inherited an environment and there's a lot of things that you know you need to change, but you're not quite sure what it is and where it is and that sort of stuff. So yeah, definitely go and check that out. The CCO dashboard is the next one, the Continuous Cloud Optimization Power BI Dashboard project. So I believe this was a bit of MCS IP that was then open sourced on GitHub. But yeah, it's a fantastic Power BI dashboard system that uses Power BI to interrogate a bunch of APIs inside Azure and Azure AD, and provides you this really rich set of dashboards. So I think from an ops perspective, when we're on-prem, we always have those big screens up with the monitoring screens and that sort of stuff, with the big TV on the wall and that sort of stuff. This could easily be your Azure equivalent, to one of those sorts of things. So, and that covers Azure governance and infrastructure, and there's a bunch of stuff in there about Kubernetes as well, if anyone's using AKS. We've also got the Azure Optimization Engine. So this is written by another CE, Helder Pinto. Apologies if I have murdered your name. But this is sort of like a really impressive extension onto the Azure Advisor system. So this takes all the advisor recommendations as well as a bunch of Azure Resource Graph queries to find things like a standard load balancer with no backend pools, or it might show disconnected NICs, or it might show machines that have been turned off and left off, or disconnected disks and that sort of stuff. So it can really help you with those well-architected framework categories like cost and security and performance and so on and so forth. So the last one was a great write-up by a CE from Melbourne, Anthony Weatherston, tag with creator. So I found this one when a customer was asking me, well, how do I make sure that I can sort of find out who has created what, or like where did resources come from? So this is really cool. So he's done a great write-up on the tech community site, which we'll post a link to later, which has got the method he went through in building an event-driven function that basically has, an event comes from an Azure subscription, and then that you passes that to a PowerShell function, which has got rights via managed identity to be able to go and append a tag to the caller. So I thought that was quite neat. Absolutely a cool tool there. So if you've got any other cool tools, if there's other things you think we should know about, or you want us to elevate, let us know, because we're absolutely happy to put them on this. Cool. So if everyone can post your questions with either a Q or a question mark or something like that, so that we know they're out there, and then we will answer them at the end. We've got a bunch of sort of pre-canned questions that we're going to discuss, and then we'll come through with those other questions at the end. So Stu, I might pass over to you to hand off to you to let you ask these first questions, and we'll start with the panel discussion.
Yeah, no problem. And thank you, Nick. For any beginners to Azure, Nick just demonstrated some of the super complexity that we can have with some of the things when you're getting started. I think I counted sort of about 10 or 12 acronyms in some of those, Nick, with your GitHub things. So it's it's a scary place, and that's sort of why today we wanted to really have a bit of a discussion with someone, and we've asked Gareth to come on here just as someone who has done the journey from on-premises to cloud. And really, it's quite a scary time when the industry is moving forwards to very new things. And we wanted to try and get some of the experience of Gareth, and Nick and myself are going to answer some of these questions as well, just to really help you on your way. So without further ado, let's move on to the first question, Nick, that we're going to ask our guest, Gareth. Okay, so question one would be, which on-premises technical background did you come from, Gareth? I guess a bit of history there, but also what kind of tools and technologies were you seen as an expert in before you came here to the big cloud?
Well, it depends how far back you want to go. I started off as a Windows desktop guy, and I think the first piece of automation I ever wrote was a thing called Scripted. If you ever remember that tool from like 1,000 years ago, and then went from desktop management then into server, Windows Server admin and Windows Server management, that sort of stuff. So my main technical background with on-prem was Windows Server, System Center management. Then in the later years, Hyper-V for the on-premises stuff. I was known as Mr. Hyper-V in the office for a few years there. And then Azure started to come in a big way. So yeah, mostly virtualization, Windows Server was my primary background.
Cool. Okay. Sorry, I've put us in a funny mode here. All right. Thank you, Gareth. Nick, did you want to try and answer that question yourself as well?
Yeah. So I must be one of the only IT people that didn't actually start in doing desktop support and sort of come up through server and corporate workloads. My first full-time tech job was actually working. Well, it was on a help desk, so that I started on the help desk. But then from there, I was an infrastructure person working on a website, like a government website. So I started. I used to be the infrastructure administrator for business.gov.au a very, very long time ago. So I'm one of these weird. So I was probably technically born in the cloud, but I just called it the internet then. We didn't call it the cloud, and we ran all the servers ourselves. So started with Windows Server and physical machines, probably much like Gareth, and then remember the big change that came with virtualization and Active Directory and all these other sorts of exciting technologies that sort of there. And then I guess I've always been a Windows application mid-range sort of person. Bit of networking, bit of storage, that sort of stuff. But yeah, I used to have totally awesome Windows guy as my tagline on LinkedIn for a while there. So yeah, that's my tech background. What about you, Stu?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So yeah, my background's quite different from yours. Like I started off as a Delphi developer writing code. I did stuff for Saab in Sweden and BBC scheduling software. So all this weird stuff that you talk about, these servers and networking, were really, really alien to me where I came from. So I guess over time, I kind of I kind of learned a bunch of those things, but I just focused on my development, and it was really, how do I do this thing in a Java applet? When I started, it was that far back, so it's been a long way. So it really, for me, it's a huge chasm to jump for me as a developer to infrastructure and then on to cloud. So that's something we can talk more about today.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
Shall I ask
I'll ask this one because I changed
it.
What's the biggest challenge you've had adjusting to cloud technologies? I think, Stu, do you want to open this one? What have you found as the biggest challenge tech-wise?
Yeah, moving to cloud technology. So for me, I had done a bit of SharePoint Online and so forth. So I kind of used the cloud as a software as a service kind of consumer, I suppose, when I did SharePoint Online. I guess the hardest thing for me personally was figuring out all that networking and so forth and thinking about how to turn on the security features. So a lot of the services in cloud have very strong security features, but for me, it was new that I had to put a firewall on a website or something to stop people outside from accessing it or something like that. So that was probably my biggest challenge. I'll pass on to Gareth, I suppose. Gareth, what about yourself?
Yeah, for me, it was all the I'll generically say web stuff. Because everything in the cloud is a URL. Everything is available over web protocols, and if you spent your time in client server, especially corporate or enterprise client server, unless you were looking after web servers specifically, you never really had anything to do with URLs. It was all UNC paths and internal DNS and client server communications that way. So probably the biggest adjustment actually was more the separation of the data plane and the management plane in Azure, and then everything in the management plane's a URL. So a normal thing, if you're on an on-prem network, you'd all be on the one network all the time, and you never really had to think about, okay, if I'm going to copy this virtual disk image up to my where I'm storing them, that would probably be some kind of UNC or file copy operation or whatever. And as long as requisite firewalls were open, you could get there. Now then adjusting to Azure to say, okay, well I've got my connection to my on-premises network set up, and I've got that data plane networking, I've got all my VNets, and I've got all my subnets, and I've got all that sorted. Now I want to do a copy of a disk image up to a repository that's not on the same network. That's then going to your management plane, which is all internet and URL based. So that was probably the biggest adjustment, just getting my head into the web space.
Yeah, that's great. And I would probably echo that as well. I think, the challenge that I've had adopting to cloud technologies has probably been the rate of change for the learning, I think. And I love it. And it's also something that is a little bit tiring sometimes because, you will be best practice in the on-prem world. We have three-tier architectures. We have three-tier sort of storage virtualization, those sorts of things at a platform level. That hasn't changed for a long period of time. We've got things like HCI and that sort of stuff, I guess, as other changes. But the rate of change and the different sort of architectures that you can get in cloud, event-driven stuff or other sorts of things, I think that's been the biggest challenge is just learning all these new different types of architectures, and things that I would always do on-prem are probably just as valid in the cloud, but also sometimes there are new ways of doing things, and so it becomes a bit more of a decision of which way to use, what to use. So yeah,
that's really good. Thanks, Nick. All right, shall I ask the next question?
I think you should.
All right. So what advice would you give your pre-cloud self about learning the cloud now? Who wants to put their hand up for this one first?
Yeah, a big intake of breath there, Nick. You're looking like you're ready to go.
So what would advice would I give my pre-cloud self? Maybe I think we're going to cover this as a later question, but don't be afraid to start with the portal is probably the big thing. I think there's a belief that you have to sort of start with the end in mind, which is fine, but you also, ducks don't ride an elevator and jump off the top of a building, to steal a big Bill Hicks quote, to learn to fly. You got to start running, crawling, walking, that sort of stuff. So my advice is, whatever you're doing, start and keep going with that, and then you will eventually get to that point where you're writing infrastructure as code and all sorts of other cool and amazing things. But don't be afraid to keep starting at the very start is probably the advice that I would give to my cloud self. I think in the early stages, I was like, I'm not a programmer. I can't program stuff. I'm not going to be able to get into the cloud. I'm not going to be good at, I'm okay at PowerShell, but I'm not like amazing. And therefore the cloud is going to be really locked off from me. But knowing what I know now, I think, that's probably a bit wrong. The other piece of advice I would give myself is your on-prem experience in integrating things in an enterprise Windows network is going to be very useful in the cloud, because, that is still very valid in all of the things you already know about DNS and Windows and networking and any of the security, any of these sorts of things. They're going to be quite valuable in the cloud. We're not all at Kubernetes and containers and all these other sort of scary concepts yet. So, yeah, that'd be my advice. What about you, Gareth?
Don't start with ARM. That would probably be my first piece of advice.
Good advice.
Well, echoed what you said. Don't be afraid of the portal. I think for me, the main thing I would tell myself going back on it now is look, just jump in and don't be scared of it. Start with the portal. Start deploying stuff. You do so obviously in an environment where you're not going to break or hurt anyone, but don't be scared to just jump in, get your hands dirty, and learn, because I think that's the best way to do it. The other thing I would say is, whilst a lot of that integration experience is useful, it's certainly not like you're learning a whole new thing. Some of the initial learning curve is a bit harder, simply because normally when we learn, we relate to something we know. And if we know on-prem really well, then it's when we start that learning journey, sometimes those hooks into how we would do it aren't there. So that makes your initial steps on that journey can be a little bit slippery, is the best analogy I can think of. But that's very short-lived, and it's shorter lived than you think it will be when you first hit it. So just keep pushing through, keep learning, keep trying to say, okay, well, in this scenario, in my workplace, how would I achieve this? How would I do this equivalent thing to what I'm doing now on-prem? Start with the equivalency, and then you can start to but I can do this thing better, and I can do this thing faster, and I can do this thing easier. And those things come. Also, don't, if you're an infrastructure person and you're used to sort of infrastructure style deployments and scripting, DevOps will be your friend. Working with infrastructure as code and DevOps and pipeline deployment, and it's not so much that, it's more the control that you have through that process. If you've gone to me 5-10 years ago and said, hey, we could have an infrastructure environment where dev absolutely is the same as production, and every single change is controlled and known, I would have just slapped you in the head and gone, yeah, nice fantasy. But we literally can get to that place, and that's an exciting thing.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Gareth. My pre-cloud self was probably a computer programmer who built web apps and stuff like that, and there was all these mysterious things that I kind of heard people talk about when my web app that worked on my machine went and got deployed by, I guess, people like you guys, really. And they'd talk about things like, I know, load balancers and stuff. And I'd be like, well, what's a load balancer? Because I just did not know. As a someone who built websites, that was kind of my end. I'm sorry, they're noisy here. So for me, all I would suggest to myself is go and get curious and build that Hello World app, and maybe try and play around with some of those things like that load balancer and understand where it might fit if I deployed an application to the cloud. figure out how I can do it myself. And using the Azure portal is great advice. You know, I love DevOps, and everything should be automated if it's repeated, but it's not the best way to get familiar straight up. It's something you do after you've built that first website with the hello world, and following some of the tutorials that might include a load balancer is probably what I'd suggest I did first, because it would have saved me a whole lot of headache talking to folk like the infrastructure folk here about that.
Well, sorry, I was going to say I still use it today. So even though bulk of my stuff is now done through IAC, if I've got a concept that I want to very quickly prototype just to make sure that it's going to do what I expect it to do, I'll deploy it in the portal just to get the layout and just to make sure that the components plug in how I expect them to plug in before I then go, okay, now I'm gonna code this up for repeatable and well managed deployment.
Absolutely. I think one feature I really like about our portal is that you can deploy things via the portal, and then you can go and look at the deployment script to sort of see exactly what was deployed from an infrastructure code perspective. So
I use that every day.
Yeah, me too. There's a lot of export to template and then read the template to kind of get an understanding of it. Sorry, Stu.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. It's a time investment to write a script, be that an ARM template or Terraform or whatever you do. It's an investment of time. So I like to typically create things in the portal, see how they look, and then go back and automate them. I think that's a really good way of doing that.
Well, the inverse of that, if you're trying to automate the deployment of something and you don't fundamentally understand kind of what it does and how it works, you're on a bit of a rough path, I'd suggest.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think that's actually a great segue into our next question, which is, do you need to be able to write code to get to the cloud or to use the cloud? So I would argue, no, you don't. Especially if your workload is a migration workload, you absolutely do not need to write any code to get to the cloud. There is a lot of value in learning how to write code to get to the cloud, to automate things, to provide change control and sort of traceability of any changes in your environment, via Git or via Azure DevOps or something like that. But I would say you don't need to write code to get to the cloud and to get started. I think if you learn and you sort of go to that next level, you absolutely, there's a lot of value in learning how to do it, but it's not, I don't think it's an essential. What do you guys think?
I'd echo that and say in terms of a learning journey, I don't think it's required. I think in terms of managing a cloud environment at scale, I think it is. But that's a separate thing. That's a separate thing to your learning journey, right? And that level of maturity doesn't immediately just happen. It was your sort of, crawl, walk, run analogy before. Yeah, we've had several customers who have absolutely the intention to get to a fully code managed environment. It's exceedingly difficult to immediately start there. You have to start small. And one customer, in terms of DevOps, started using the graphical pipeline tool. To represent those deployment steps in a graphical format, which is fine. Pretty quickly hit limitations and then go, right, we actually got to start doing this in the YAML code. But that's a perfectly great way of walking through those steps before you just hit. Because if you've come from a scripting background, so if you started with Visual Basic, I'm dating myself here, started with Visual Basic or PowerShell, script it, if that's your background, ARM's very different and YAML's very different, and doing logic in YAML and ARM isn't the easiest thing in the world, frankly. I'm desperately, when Bicep's on the up and getting more mature, and I can easily see myself moving to Bicep entirely. But
it's pretty great.
It's just the logic execution so much better. But those are not insignificant learning curves. So you do need to give yourself the time and the space, and be a bit kind to yourself as well when your first dozen deployments don't go right, and it keeps rejecting your ARM and saying it's not valid, and you I'd say pull your hair out. You can see why what my Azure journey cost me, but Yeah, be kind to yourself. It is a learning curve, and if you don't get it straight away, just keep plugging away. You will get it.
I think I'll turn that around a bit, that question. Now I read it, I think, do you need to be able to write more code or do more scripting than you would an on-premise environment of a similar nature? I would say no. Like the best on-premise environments that I've seen, people are already writing scripts to make things repeatable and reliable. And I think you can translate so much of that knowledge that, writing C# code or JavaScript or whatever is one, but PowerShell's another, or Bash scripts. I work with a lot of customers who do heaps of stuff with Linux and Bash scripts, and that's how they automate. And absolutely, you can translate that really well, I think, to the cloud. And what I really love about the cloud is that actually I can treat everything as code where I want to, right? Because I am a coder. I create a button on a form in the old days. Now I can create a load balancer. That's super cool to me. So I think it really helps to have a coding background when you come to the cloud. But you don't have to. You can click through the portal. All of our kind of documentation seems to lead you through how to do it as scripts, how to do it with like Azure CLI, how to do it through the portal. So there's lots of different ways of doing the same thing. I think that choice can be paralyzing sometimes. So just getting started and doing it in the portal is probably where I like to go. Yeah.
Yeah, it's typical Microsoft, right? We always give you 50 ways to skin the cat.
Well, we have to recognize and meet people where they are, because I think we all come from different backgrounds, and the three of us here work for similar size enterprises, I think, but we have experts at Microsoft who weren't even in IT before they joined and got a cloud career. So I think that's really, it's really open to everyone to join in, because there's so many different choices about how you do things.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Stu. So I might ask this one: what technologies do you think all cloud people need to understand? Do you think there's any technology that if someone's out there right now, they're living their best on-prem life, they want to sort of get to the cloud, what should they go and read about or try and understand technology-wise? I would say web stuff, Gareth. Understand what a URL and a URI is and know what an API is, I think. Probably is the stuff that I would say, because by its very nature, cloud is at scale, and it's at least hyperscale public cloud like Microsoft Azure. You need to understand that it is underneath. It is like a big API and a series of other APIs that you call, and then stuff happens, right? I think that understanding the basics of that stuff is a really good first step to understanding why, when you click on things in the portal, they might take a little while or something else happens. So and I think that basic understanding is that will catapult you, and you don't need to know, to the nth degree how the APIs function under the covers and stuff like that. You just need to know how to call them, or if something else is calling them sort of on your behalf, whether that's being done through the portal or through some kind of intermediary interface. But knowing that how all that stuff is then ultimately getting executed does help. So in terms of the actual underlying question, though, what do you think all people should know? I don't know about all people so much, but what I would say there is, when you've come from an on-prem background, particularly in larger enterprises that had dedicated teams to do specific things, like, for example, you could be a Windows Server guy and not know much about networking, because it's all done by the networking team, and for a long time, as long as the blue cable went into the server patch panel and there was a light on, then past that it was Harry Potter stuff as far as I was concerned. Could have been people waving wands and saying incantations in the background. I didn't know and didn't care, as long as the packets got to where they needed to go. That kind of siloed actioning is not as effective with cloud, and you really need to have a good general knowledge set across all of the baselines. And so in terms of what all people need to know, I think just to have a good general knowledge of
of all of those elements in terms of compute, storage, networking, to be able to bring those together, because you can't work effectively in those siloed teams like we used to.
I'm gonna jump in and say, what technologies do you think all cloud people need to understand? I guess understanding that the technology of cloud makes it easy to rework things. You know, going to what Gareth just said, like, it used to be a 6-month project to stand up, I don't know, use Service Bus or something, and, you know, a team of 20 managing that. Now each project can have the autonomy to spin up their own, and I think that's really good. So those paralyzing decision points that we typically had on premises doesn't mean there's no governance required, but I think the approach, do your research, come to a decision as a group with the expertise, and really just recognize that you can adjust your technology choice. I think that's really, more than technology, it's the approach for me, I would say. Definitely networking and things like that obviously add value to run a website, because you need to understand how that works. But if I'm using public Azure App Service, I don't have a whole lot of networking complexity to deal with. I do need to understand that I might want to put a web application firewall in front of it or something, but it'll end there. I don't need to understand everything about load balancers and, you know, private IPs and stuff. So yeah, that's probably how I would answer that one, I think.
Yeah, that's cool. I think they're both really good points. I think understanding those core NIST characteristics of cloud is also a really helpful thing just to understand. Like you say, Stu, we can hit an API and stuff can happen, and then we can hit the same API and destroy that stuff very quickly with minimal or no cost in a lot of cases. So understanding that rate of change now exists, and if you're an architect or a solution designer, like, your toolbox just got a whole lot bigger to be able to use all these different things, right? So,
well, the exciting thing there for me, which is, again, you don't have to start here, but it's definitely a place that you want to get to, is the representation of all of those components in code. Even if you're just looking at it from a networking layer, if you're in a complex enterprise that, say, has multiple locations even around the world, or and a fairly complex network infrastructure represented in Azure, if you're talking about the equivalent of that on-prem, and you were to say if some kind of disaster were to befall you, and how quickly could you reproduce that entire environment from scratch, most environments or most organizations wouldn't even be able to answer the question as to how long it may even take them, if it would be possible for them to do it at all. Whereas in the cloud world, with it all represented as code, it can be as simple as literally rerunning a pipeline, and you have everything back exactly how it was. And exactly how you know that configuration, that working good configuration to be.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the things I am such a big fan of. That ability that your change control could be out in the open in a pipeline, in terms of, you know, what are the things that have changed, and then how do we sort of make the decision on whether they go to the next environment there. So I'll jump to the next question, which is one that I sort of mull about sometimes. So, do you think doing certifications is worth it? Stu, what do you reckon?
I just popped up a question there that we had from someone, but let's cover off this certifications one. Like, a long time ago, I used to think that certifications were definitely a revenue raising opportunity for the big organization that were essentially selling that exam, right? And so often it was old-fashioned and not up to date, and I found it really expensive for me. When I was a computer programmer, when I wanted to learn about infrastructure, going and doing a certification would mean investing my time and money to do that, and I felt that it was really, really challenging. Now, the certification paths, I think, now are much more up to date. And I think they have a lot of relevance to the type of workloads that I see customers deploying. Like, I work with a lot of teams who go through the certification process, and they'll take the exam, and pass or fail, they have still learned a heap. It gave them some structured learning. So I think the certification process adds value. Taking the exam, I would say, is optional, but definitely sort of makes it clear to people that you have that level of experience, and you can use that to go back to your employer and say, hey, I'm a cloud expert. You can see the certification here. So they can add value in certain situations, but you don't always have to invest your money. Maybe you get a free exam voucher from doing some of the training, and then you can get started that way. So they definitely can add value, I would say. But the process of doing the certification is more valuable than the certification itself, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
What do you reckon, Gareth?
So I think I find them valuable personally. I think they've always been good to undertake, but I've always been, I guess, a fan of them, right, going back to the old NT4 MCSE days. I think it obviously very much dictates how useful they are, really determines on your approach to them. If you're just trying to get the exam knocked over and you go to brain dump sites, then they're not very useful at all. If you're undertaking the study to understand the core concepts and how the core concepts work, then of course they're very useful. But what I'd add is it's a different world. Cloud's a different world now from on, because you remember we had that 3 to 5 year cycle with on-prem. All the on-prem product, your whatever year version of it would release, it had the set of features that it had the integrations that it had. This was support, connection to this was supported, connection to that wasn't. And then that would pretty much be the state of play for 3 to 5 years. So you knew if you made that initial learning investment to get that certification, then you were good for some number of years until the next versions of stuff came out, and then you had to take the refresh and do it again. But it's very cloud. So I think with cloud, people sort of go, well, why would I bother to go and do the certification when it's changing so fast that in 3 months' time or 6 months' time, most of what I'm studying's not valid. And what I'd say to that is again, if you're learning the core concepts don't change very quickly. The exact widgets and the features, and particularly supportability of what connects to what and where it is, all of that changes very, very rapidly. But the exams aren't about learning those things. And in fact, you shouldn't try and memorize those things because they do change so quickly. Every time you go to look to deploy something or to design something, you should be checking those things because they may well have changed since the last time you looked at it even 2 weeks ago. So it's really about studying to learn those core concepts. They will stay with you. They're not a waste of time, and they don't change that quickly. So from that point of view, I think they're very valuable.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's a great point, is just not trying to learn exactly. It always kind of bugs me whenever there's certification questions and they're like, what does this SKU do, or this SKU and that sort of SKU? Because my answer to that is I'm not going to bother memorizing any of that stuff, because likely it will have changed. And two, I can always just go and reference the documentation or something like that to see what is new and what is going to be sort of the most appropriate. So yeah, I think and referencing it on a regular basis is a really good habit to get into in terms of cloud deployment. And that is a thing that you're not used to when you're coming from on-prem. Yeah, I mean, if you've set up your own, like if you're the platform provider internally and you've set up the virtualization and the storage and that sort of stuff, systems, you've built, an automated method of deploying virtual machines or databases or applications out to your internal teams. You're you've gone through and you've defined all of that stuff. But when you move to the cloud, there's less value in I guess doing that sort of stuff, because that sort of stuff is in a way already defined for you by the fact that you're taking sort of a platform service, right? So do I think doing certifications is worth it? I do, but I also think that firsthand experience and time using this sort of stuff and familiarity, that is also very valuable. I'm a learn by doing sort of person, so I think doing it as well, and then when you've been doing it for a while, then undertaking the sort of certification path is absolutely the best way to go.
Yeah, I know everybody learns potentially differently, but I can't even imagine attempting to take one of those exams having just read the content on docs or in a book and not having jumped in the portal and done it.
Yeah, like deploying something at least once and that sort of stuff. So
yeah, and when I did my first certification, I thought I naively thought I would just go and buy a book and read it. And then as I started reading the book, I got curious and I started to go and do the things that were in the book. And I think that's why I passed that exam. It was, really hands-on was great because it taught me so much more. And so you can't parrot style learn the certification answers for the current crop of Microsoft exams in today's era, because they've recognized that what they want is people who are experienced and who have critical thinking about the options for deploying something. So for me, I used to go to the Azure portal, go new virtual machine, and then read all the things there to see just what are the options. Oh, what if I tick this box? What does that mean? And that's how I got much of my knowledge, rather than reading the book that I bought. So it was much more useful, I think, to actually do it and deploy. And then you can just tear it down. So I didn't spend a lot of money on that at that time. It was just create the virtual machine and then just remove it, and then I wasn't charged anymore. So that was sort of something that wasn't open to me in the on-prem days to learn certification.
No one's going to give you programmers just a load balancer to play around with so you can get your handle on it, right? Because they cost tens of thousands of dollars and we don't just have them lying around. But in the cloud, you can do that, right? You can get that first-hand experiential knowledge about what it's like for someone else to have to do that bit. Yeah.
There's a much bigger scope of opportunity for you to learn in the cloud, simply because you're not constrained by those types of resources. Again, thinking back to my old MCSE, NT4 days, the best study I had was however many junk PCs I could scrounge together through bits of old gaming PCs that I'd built over the years, and could I scrounge enough parts to get 3 or 4 servers built so I could actually do some networking stuff and actually have different servers talking to different servers. This is in pre-virtualization days, and we just don't have any of those kinds of constraints or limits anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely one of the most exciting things, I think, from a learning and certification journey as well. So we might crack on question-wise, because I'm just looking at the time. So what kind of career paths are there to cloud if I'm a DBA, a developer, or a network, Linux, Windows admin? And we do have a question here from Karmik as well, which we'll cover at the end, but also, maybe there's some discussion here that we can sort of talk about in the reference to that. So I absolutely think there are career paths across all of these things. The question is, and we sort of alluded to this earlier, but depending on the size of your organization and depending on the size of your team that's going to be involved in cloud, I think is really going to determine whether you end up very specialized like you would do in a large organization, or whether you end up with a bit more broad set of knowledge. So understanding where your skills are at and what you're interested in, I think would in my mind sort of dictate where your career path wants to go, right? So from a data perspective, you might become like a cloud data person, or a cloud networking person, or like a general cloud person who does virtual machines and a little bit of everything else. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think that whatever your current skill base is, for the most part, there is some kind of vaulting platform into cloud. If you just look at the things that you've got listed there, well, there's still, if you're a Windows Server admin, say, well, there's still very likely going to be Windows Server admin work to do. It's just going to be done slightly differently. And there's things that would be the same, and there's things that will be potentially quite different that you can really sink your teeth into learning. A good example might be, say, if I'm doing VM management, Windows Server admin, let's say, you might initially, when your organization's first deploying to Azure, you might treat that as an extension of your regular data center, and how you patch and manage those machines might be the same as what you do today. You're still plugging them into the same management infrastructure that you've currently got, and you just treat them like a VM on your network. But in other areas, such as monitoring, you very likely won't be using the same monitoring tools. So you're just plugging in and getting the Windows metrics from the VM. That's not reliable, because it's not the effectively the hypervisor metrics of what's really happening, and you have to do that through Azure Monitor and through the Azure Fabric. So that's a new area that you can kind of sink your teeth into to learn and explore and really come to grips with how that works. And then if you're the person who knows that, understands that, how that monitoring works in the cloud, then you're the person of value to your organization when they move in that direction.
Cool, thank you. Geez, this is a really hard question, I think. What kind of career paths are there? I guess you can think about role-based or kind of technology-based. Like, as a developer background person, I could go and do DBA work now in the cloud, because really I might use DevOps to stand up a new database instance. Whereas I didn't have the server or the software to stand up a database server in my regular work. So I guess it's opened up more opportunity and more choice, which has kind of made it hard. I'm thinking about people watching this and thinking that this might not give them much clarity, but there's so much choice. Well, if you start looking at going back to the certifications, if you look at some of the certifications, there's some broad certifications paths into DevOps or architecture or developer. And I think maybe the career paths might be to say, hey, why don't I challenge myself and see if I can get to the point where I know all that stuff that's in that certification path. And I think the roles will come to you, really. We've actually got some information on the types of roles that are available and the skills gaps that are in the market that we're going to share a bit later. And I think that might help people. It might only be the dollar figures that people chase there, but that help persuade them. Nick, do you have a better answer for that? Because I feel like I was rambling a little bit there.
No, I think probably the biggest thing in terms of that change for career path is really, if you were the person that ran the platform, if you were the Fabric administrator, you were the person that sort of did that, then moving to the cloud is going to be a bit of a change for you, because your skills are going to go up. You are not going to be responsible for the physical. You're not going to be responsible for the data center. You're not going to be responsible for the physical, the cooling and that sort of stuff, or the security or the concrete or any of those sorts of things. You're not responsible for racking the servers anymore, right? That people in those sort of areas, they're the things where that's where I'm looking at, like, what else are you interested in? What else can you get passionate about that is further up that OSI sort of 7-layer stack? I think if you're doing like Windows system administration or you're doing enterprise system administration, transitioning your skills up the stack, so into the operating system, into the application, at the networking layer, that sort of stuff is where I sort of see your career going. Because if your organization is looking at using public cloud, then like a lot of that stuff underneath is going to be covered by the cloud provider. Now, it's not to say that cloud is going to be the only game in town. I personally believe that we're always going to be in a hybrid environment, right? In whatever sort of form. But yeah, I think if you're interested in those sorts of things and interested in going into the cloud, then there are a lot of different career paths. And like you said, Stu, we've like Microsoft Learn does a great job in sort of showing those career paths that are available there.
Yeah, and Pluralsight actually has a bunch of different career paths and directions that you can see where you're up to against, which I thought was really cool. I haven't seen that recently, but there's certainly some really good resources on the learning sites to help you mold what you're interested in learning into a career path, I suppose. Yep.
So yeah, what skills or experience should people seek out to help them land that cloud role? In my mind, I think experience is king personally, or queen. Like the top should be skills and experience, and then certifications, and then everything else. And I would say to people that you should seek out a role that's going to give you that sort of experience, even if that's maybe within a smaller organization or within a different organization than one you're in, if you're in a big enterprise, because the likelihood of you getting a varied experience and being able to cross many things as opposed to just being siloed into one, I think is going to be much easier to achieve in a different sort of organization size. What do you guys reckon?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think the key thing there is the word experience, in terms of what experience do you want to have, in terms of what do you want to learn, and what type of activities do you want to do. If you're placed in the strategy. You want to do strategy and architecture and just play at that level, then going and getting a job in cloud operations, you're probably going to get pretty restless in 3 months. So not to say that experience wouldn't be valuable, like learning day to day and what experiences people have day to day and what their challenges are and what it takes to actually run these environments day to day is very, very useful experience. And then to sort of, if you want to go up higher into the strategy layers, to vault you up there. But it's all about identifying the experiences that you want to have and then working out where you can locate those, where you can go to get them. Yeah.
So I there's a comment here from Joseph, which about reference architectures and saying about how to basically when you start a new cloud project or you want to look at some shapes of things, and I think that's a really good thing to raise. The architectures that you can find now are very well documented. You can read a lot of blogs and so forth, and we've got some of these resources to share. But I think to answer the question here about what skills and experience you should seek out, I would probably say GitHub. I've been working with a GitHub team a fair bit now in Australia and a bit wider than that. But basically what they do is they look at people's open source projects that they contribute to. So they might have their favorite open source tool and they just go in and contribute to that. And they often run on cloud. So I think the GitHub hiring process actually looks at your contribution to open source and your public repositories that you share. So I think that might be a really good way of gaining skills and experience where you don't necessarily have a job open to you. Go and build a to-do list or something for your family and build it openly on GitHub and then deploy it to the cloud and just play around with it. And you could share it with your friends, I think, and then that's something you can share and say, like, I haven't had this opportunity at work, but, I've got a software background. I can go and build something and deploy it to the cloud. And then I can go to an employer and say, look, I don't have a lot of hands-on in the organization, but what I've done is I've done this on my weekends at home and I've just built this. And actually, this is quite similar to the kind of websites you build for your organization and would want to go to the cloud. And you might be ahead of your prospective employer because you've actually deployed that to the cloud and some are just getting started with their journey. So I think that by going through and building something out yourself, I think that is really valuable.
Yeah, that's great, Stu. I think that's a really good point. The barrier to entry in terms of getting skills and experience in the cloud, I think, is actually a lot lower, right? You can make a load balancer and it'll cost you $1 or maybe less if you sort of tear it down once you're finished using it, as opposed to having to go out and buy one like Gareth and I would have had to do in the old days and check out computer auctions or that sort of stuff to see if we can find these things so you can get skills and experience. And some of it is also sort of luck of the draw, right? Like the organization you end up in, the opportunities that are afforded to you by, whatever the things are, can really dictate the skills and experience you've had. But nothing will stop you from trying to get that skills and experience in the cloud by sort of taking your own approach to building those things out. So how can people get started learning in the cloud right now? What do you think?
portal.azure.com. It's probably a pretty good place to start, I'd say.
Yeah, I would even say the Learn site on Microsoft Docs as well is absolutely fantastic. So you can do your AZ900 Azure fundamentals through that. It has a little sandbox thing, which kind of you can have a live cloud shell to do things inside that. I think that's another great sort of way to start learning as well. If you're intimidated by the portal, maybe start there and then get into the portal, like Gareth says, and build a virtual network and click around and familiarize yourself with the interface and that sort of stuff. Stu, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Just get in there and start. But I think just thinking thinking about that headache that you might have where, you want to teach your kids maths and you're doing it on paper or something, and you just create a basic, as a developer person, just create a basic quiz and deploy it to a static website or something that doesn't cost much to run, and just get in there. I think really there's a few options, and some of the prizes we have to give away later actually give you some credit to get started. There's actually free Azure stuff to get started as well, so you can get on there and sign up for a free trial and use that away from your workplace. And I find that really much less constrained than certainly some of the more stricter environments like, say, government or financial. They really struggle to, it's quite hard to get in there, go to the portal and start building things in some of those environments. So you can just open your Chromebook or your laptop at home and just get started, just, with something that's simple for you. And I think that's a really good way to get started. Just get in there and have a go with the portal. The doc site is fantastic. There's some great content there. Pluralsight, LinkedIn Learning. There's a whole load of other things that I think are really good options too.
The John Saville Masterclass series, I think we've got linked in our URL list as well towards the end. That's absolutely worth if you want to start from the cloud by John Saville, who's a principal CSA who works for Microsoft. He's absolutely fantastic, really good, and does a lot of great content on his YouTube as well. So what was the biggest mistake you made or you see other people making in their cloud journey? So I think one of the biggest mistakes I made personally when we started, so I started using Azure in 2015, where ASM was still Azure Service Manager. So what it used to be called, ASM.
Now definitely.
We call it Classic. Yeah, that's our deprecated term is now Classic. So we started using ASM, and we had an on-prem automation tool that starts with V and ends in A, which I'm not going to mention. And we were platforms people, and we're like, cool, the cloud's just another platform. We're going to try and build. We'll build offerings for our people to consume internally because they won't get the cloud thing. We're sort of doing it. We're the platform people. The reality of that was that we didn't. It went nowhere. It went nowhere because we were all forced into writing integration layers to APIs that were constantly changing. None of us were really web programmers, and so there was a lot of bad PowerShell and even worse JavaScript. And if I could go back and sort of say to myself, don't do that. Just try and use the platforms natively as possible, whatever they are, like whether they are, Azure or GCP or AWS or whatever. It's learn one really well. Don't try and be the platform provider, and don't try and learn all of them at once, right? Learn one really well, then learn another one, and so on and so forth. Don't ever stop learning. So that would be the biggest mistake that I made, and that I also see some other people doing, is when you're an infrastructure person, you're used to providing the platform. Not being in charge of that platform can be quite, it leaves you a bit, you're no longer anchored to something that you're responsible for. So you try and recreate that by using those cloud technologies. So my advice is don't do that. Move up the stack and accept that is the case. Gareth, what do you reckon?
So for me, I think, I see a lot of, in my role, I see a lot of Azure implementations and how customers deploy it and manage it. And I'd say the most common mistake I see being made is people don't put any focus on governance early enough. That's probably the biggest mistake, because we have a lot of tools. Azure Policy is probably the primary one, where we can control what does and doesn't happen within the context of a subscription or larger context. And that plays a really important part, because when you're used to doing stuff on-prem, you're used to stuff inherently being a certain way, particularly in the networking side. So if I was to deploy a VM on-prem, I don't have to worry about unauthorized internet egress to that VM, because I'm just deploying it within my own network, and I know I've got the gateway people who look after to make, keep the bad guys at bay from that perspective, and I don't have to worry about it. When you start deploying stuff in Azure, if you just go into the portal and deploy a VM, by default, it's going to get a public IP address assigned. So it's got a direct connection there. So you need to, I guess, be aware that some differences with the public cloud or a public cloud provider, in that these constructs do exist on the internet. And if you're wanting to do stuff within an internal network, it's slightly different. So you've got to gear yourself up for those differences, and then to be able to control those differences. And that's where the governance and the policy part comes into it. So yeah, the biggest mistake I see is people start to utilize and deploy before they've really thought about their governance and what they want to allow people to do and not do with what they can deploy.
That's a really good one. I think mine is pretty similar to Nick's. I think don't start with multi-cloud. There's some reasons why you might want to do that. Choose the Microsoft cloud, choose another one, do it well, and then expand to others where it makes sense for you. I think because you end up with potentially the lowest common denominator of all those clouds that you choose. So we would love you to, I work for Microsoft, I'd love you to use our stuff, but using our stuff, other people's stuff at the same time, we integrate really nicely for mature organizations. But if you want to run one virtual machine in another cloud provider and one in ours and load balance across the two, it's not going to work as well as running it in one of those cloud providers, because the services are tuned to connect to our VMs in our cloud and in other, if I put a load balancer there, it knows about Azure VMs, and the load balancer in other cloud providers knows about their VMs. So it's possible, but I would say do it as the exception rather than the rule. I think that's probably the biggest advice I would give there. Do multi-cloud for specific reasons considered.
Is that something you think you made as a mistake?
Now, my biggest mistake in cloud was spinning up a service before I really knew about the cost, all the cost things that you can learn. So one of the first things when I spin things up in the cloud now with customers is I show them how to use the cost management features and teach them. I span up something that was quite expensive, and I ended up with a bit of bill shock, really, on credit card. So I had to have the hard conversation, with my partner, and she was quite displeased about that. So in terms of errors, that was, do we feed the kids? Does Dad play with cloud? Like
Dad might have to get a second job so we can feed the kids.
Yeah, well, like that was before we had the budgets and things that are now available to you. So if anyone's keen to get started with cloud and they're a big enterprise, then really seek out your cloud solution architects to help you understand the costs, because we want to minimize that opportunity for bill shock, because really we want you to really prosper with the cloud. So certainly the Microsoft Learn things on cost management are excellent as well if you're getting started on your own, and they will avoid that hard conversation that I had to have there.
Yeah, except maybe with the people from finance and not your significant other.
Yeah, like it's something to be aware of. It's awareness. It's not something to be feared. Like start with the cost management. John Savile has some great cost management stuff, and you can watch that, and he explains it really well. So.
I think this is our last question here before we go to audience questions. So remember, audience, there's prizes to be had. So definitely ask any questions you have. That you'd like us to sort of answer. That'd be awesome. With this one, what are the biggest changes to your day-to-day role from your on-prem life? I think for me personally, the biggest change is that as a solution designer, as an architect, like my toolbox is just way bigger than it was on-prem. On-prem, I had load balancers, as Stu likes. I had virtual machines. I had software that could be written or designed. I had COTS products and that sort of stuff. But that wasn't really, I wasn't doing a lot of stuff with event-driven architectures. I didn't have an intelligent platform underneath that I could use to get state and interrogate things and do that sort of stuff. So the biggest change for me is keeping up with all the learning and the fact that there's so much more available to doing solution design. I think that's my big change.
Yes, I think for me, and this is one part of my job, certainly not all of it, but I think the biggest part of it for me, change is really a lot more coding than what I used to do, frankly. We did used to, I mean, those options were always there to automate a lot of stuff, but we found that in on-prem you'd have patches of automation. So, some discrete tasks that were really high value would get automated and the rest wouldn't. Certainly how all the environment plugged in together and existed as a whole was not often documented or not documented well. And certainly when it was documented, that documentation was never kept up to date. So I think for me, the biggest change is the change in the way we work, more so than the technology is different, of course, but for me, the big personal change is the way we work. So working in DevOps, working to a Kanban board, doing your documentation as wikis, just the way we do that work is dramatically shifted, and it's so much more productive and better doing it the way we're doing it now. I just think back to the way we used to do stuff and go like, man, I'm amazed we even managed to get stuff to turn on half the time.
I think I'll answer this one now. So I think for me, I was on premise. I was doing a lot of those things that you just suggested there, like the Kanban and stuff. So for me, that was really industry change. I think the biggest shift for me is writing less code, really, because a lot of the things I do are plug in like an AI service that I can simply call to do image recognition into my code with just a few lines of code, rather than including some DLL or something super complicated, or storage. I used to have to write to disk and now write to blob storage and stuff. And so really it's just gluing those services together. And if I use functions, then I write maybe 5 lines of code and glue together 3 or 4 services really easily without building a lot of that plumbing stuff. And I think that's been a big shift for me day to day, to be gluing things together. There's absolutely been a shift, as Gareth said, to deploying things as code and declaratively defining them in an ARM template or something. But much more, I found myself moving towards taking advantage of services that are available to me, like to support accessibility and things like that are really amazing in the cloud.
Yeah, that's awesome. I do sort of feel like being a cloud architect is a lot of a bit like Lego, right? Kind of connecting bits and pieces together, and that's the exciting thing, is that in my mind, there's a lot more Lego than there used to be. Lots of different block shapes and sizes. So yeah, we might go to audience questions now. So if anyone has questions that they would like answered, I think we've got one here from Anthony. Thanks, Stu, for making that sort of pop up there. So Anthony asks, what is the main topic or item you wish your new Azure customers would get to quickly understand first? Who wants to take this one to start?
I'll echo what I said before, in that particularly if you're talking larger customers who are used to running their on-premises networks in a particular way, I'd certainly say start with a governance layer to make sure that you're going to keep things under control, because sprawl can be a thing, and you do need to be wary of it, and you want to be mindful that the stuff that you're deploying is deployed in a manner that you are happy with the appropriate security controls around it.
Yeah, I think I would concur with that. I think if you look we have enterprise scale landing zones, and that didn't exist when I was getting started, but that is some deployable patterns that give you a lot of that governance stuff just straight up. And I think now we've got those, starting with one of those patterns, and there's ones for small and big enterprise, that's where I wish a lot of people would start. Start with that and critique it. Don't start with a blank sheet of paper for your governance. Start with a sample. Use some of the ISM work that Nick, I won't steal your thunder here, but you've been working on some ISM patterns with an internal team, and I think use that kind of stuff to get you started on your journey, I think. What about yourself, Nick?
Yeah, I think probably the first one right at the very start is just like Gareth was talking about earlier, the management plane versus the data plane, or like the platform level versus the things you do, and then the things that are, the inside the box, outside the box sort of stuff. So stuff you deploy and that sort of stuff versus the platform itself is probably the big topic that that I find some customers struggle with first, and then that leads directly into that governance, because that governance stuff becomes, how are we going to manage the bit that isn't everything we're going to deploy, right? We might deploy some subscriptions, and that might have some VMs and some networks and stuff in it. But at that layer above, who's running the platform, and how do we sort of make sure that we've matched that to, like you say, what our risk tolerance or our organizational tolerances are for that sort of stuff. So that'd probably be the first. I'd say Azure governance and understanding how the costing and the billing and that sort of stuff work, because then really, that's the biggest driver for confidence in my mind. Because if you understand that, then you're very confident that you know how to control costs, you know how to control sprawl, you know how to control security dimensions, and any of those other sorts of things that people sort of sometimes freak out about. So that's a great question, Anthony. Thanks very much.
Right, I'm going to ask a question that popped up earlier.
Yeah.
From Karmik. Karmik, 2003. As someone who has 10 plus years in enterprise infra, what tips would you give for moving into cloud where there may already be a separate or outsourced cloud team? That's a really good question, I think.
Yeah, I think that's almost more like sort of career advice, more so than anything technical. But I think that goes back to what we were saying before about the experience. And if you want to gain certain experiences working with certain technologies, and where you are currently is not able to afford you those opportunities because that's being done by a separate outsourced organization in your particular case, then I would start looking where you can gain that experience and gain those opportunities.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Gareth. I think that is a really tough position to be in, Karmik, 2003. So you've definitely got my empathy, because I was in that position, and the way I solved that in the past was to try and get onto different projects where there was cloud technologies, and in some cases I moved jobs to make sure that I was trying to get that sort of experience there. So I think that's definitely something where as well, demonstrate your own learning, demonstrate, by playing around with things, by doing courses and that sort of stuff, and getting familiar with it, because then when you do find that role or that sort of employer where that is available, you can point to that as part of your experience as to why you are keen for this, as opposed to the fact that you don't have that through the job sort of experience.
Yeah, I think there's a larger issue there, which I'll just raise quickly, just from my own personal experience. Spent many years working for an outsourcer that will remain nameless. Names will be withheld to protect the innocent, or the guilty in this case. And I really wanted to work with new technologies. I wanted to sort of make sure that we were really bringing the best technology to bear that we could to solve problems. That outsourcer was not in any way interested in doing that. It was simply maintain the wheels on the old technology as much as you can, because innovating and deploying new technology is expensive, and we want to keep as much margin in the contract as possible. I'd been with that outsourcer for probably almost 5 years, was very comfortable there, knew the people, enjoyed the people I worked with. I just didn't enjoy the work. And in the end, made the decision to pull up stumps and leave, to go seek out those experiences that I wanted. And I would never look back. It was probably one of the single best, not just career decisions that I made, but one of the single best decisions for my own day-to-day happiness that I ever made.
Yep, that definitely resonates with me too, Gareth.
Yeah, I would say my experience has always been getting along to some of the meetups. It's a shame we can't do this in person, but we've talked about the fact that we would love to. Getting along to meetups, meeting people, having these conversations with people who are going through the same thing as you is really valuable. And I think so the face-to-face meetups and standing around maybe eating pizza or something together, you just get chatting. That's how I became aware of many of my jobs. That's not, obviously there's always a process to get jobs, but they were aware of me and I was aware of them. I knew these were people I wanted to work with. So I actually, went off and learned things that would help me get a career with them in what they were doing, because I found it cool and interesting. So that's probably what I would suggest. Meetups, I think. Yeah. Have we got any more questions here, Nick? I'm just looking in the group.
I think that's it. I can't see any other questions. Does anyone have any other questions that they want to mention? Sorry, Stu.
There was a comment here from David. My advice to Karmic is to rigorously design, then deploy. I think that's actually, that's maybe referring to one of the other questions. Rigorously design and deploy. There are many nuances with Azure versus on-prem, such as cost implications, governance, permissions, different services, region availability, and so forth.
I'll make a related comment to that one, which ties back to something that I said before. One of the big differences between cloud and on-prem, and this is something that you should put in your process bag, is, again, when I don't commit to a design on paper until I've prototyped it, which
me too.
We never really used to do that in on-prem because the barriers to entry were too high. With the cloud, that's not the case, and there are so many little integration nuances and in many cases, frankly, limitations between various services that you really want to put something down in a prototype and make sure it's going to work end to end the way you expect, and that you're not going to get bitten by some little limitation that's buried way down deep in the doco that's hard to find. So prototyping, I think, is just should be a key part of your design process.
Absolutely agree, Gareth. I think almost I would love to see the end of the large monolithic design document that's written without a prototype that, is 80 to 100 pages long and contains a bunch of tables that nobody ever reads until someone new joins, and then they read it and it's 12 months out of date.
And it's out of date. Yeah, it's just like, it's such a bad way to approach things, and look, I'll cop MCS to a degree sometimes still does it. It's not the way we prefer to work, but sometimes customers say, no, design document comes before any implementation or deployment, and you end up writing this 150-page design document that no one's ever going to read, and the tables of stuff that kills me, right? That should be in code, not in a Word document.
It could be a live query, right? Like you could, if you can query the platform, you could query the platform and understand exactly how many machines have been deployed, or what their sizing is, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's definitely an evolution in that sort of thinking, I reckon.
Yeah, I worked with a customer that had to deliver a design document as part of their project, and so they built everything and then generated the design documentation. Now, that isn't definitely the best way to go, but it's certainly one way of doing it that wasn't open to you before. Because you can just adjust things until they work and then export that design. That's a really, really new thing. Yeah.
It might even end up being a bit more honest, because then you can sort of say, here's the exported design, and then provide the design justifications as to why, we're going to try this way and that didn't work, and we're going to try that way, and that was stopped because of this, and so on and so forth. So,
well, you're not buying that hardware. That's the big thing. That hardware procurement cycle is gone. You can just spin this stuff up, spit out the documentation, shut it down, not spend any more on it, and you've got a design that you then take to the next environment. I think that's super cool. I've just got a comment here from Anthony, who says a key skill in transitioning to the cloud is to know when and when not to use cloud native capability. You can build on premises in the cloud, but it's generally inefficient. Any comments on that, gents?
Yeah, one thing, I think that's a good point. I'd also extend on that a little bit to say that when you're talking about hybrid scenarios, at the start of the journey, when we were talking about this years and years ago, when Azure was first it was a new thing. The main definition of hybrid was if you've got a network connection between on-prem and cloud. There you go. That's hybrid. But now there's certain what you could look at as hybrid capabilities that to me are really exciting, because they're only possible in the cloud. If you look at something like Sentinel, where we've got access to something like 1 billion data points, then with the threat analytics that goes over that, and then applying our threat modeling and our AI to that, to then provide insights for customers who are plugged into that service for stuff that's happening not on their network but all over the world in various networks, to be able to build a sort of an aggregate threat profile. That's impossible on-prem. It's just simply impossible. There is no organization that I have ever seen that would have the maturity or the capability to build a service like that. Certainly then they wouldn't have the capability to reach out and have all the sensors that we have across that global reach. So when you're looking at cloud native capabilities, it's also about certain capabilities that are possibilities now that were just impossible in a siloed on-prem world.
I think that's a really good point. I'm just going to finish with one last comment here from AG Pennypaker. Sorry. RE design agree, but a lot of customers insist on it. Examples of how to get around that.
If you figure it out, AG Pennypaker, can you let us know, please? Because
you can always make the argument, right? And again, through the MCS experience, I say we always make the argument, and sometimes customers agree and sometimes they don't. So you won't win every argument, but for me, the best way to try and move away, and I'm assuming that you're referring back to that sort of, let's have the 100-page design before we deploy anything. If we can really articulate the benefits of the iterative model and also the iterative value model, in order to say, well, you can do this and you'll get something that you can start using in 10 weeks, 12 weeks, or whatever it is, or we can go with a minimum viable product, an MVP, look at what is the core thing that you need that will provide you value right now, and if you follow our methodology, you can have that in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or depending on what the service is and how much groundwork and governance we have to do. But it's that time to value. If your argument can focus on the time to value, you're going to be more likely to be successful and convince people that that's the best way to go. But sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't.
Yeah, I'll add that some customers are quite happy to do an as-built. So they'll use a lot of DevOps and templating, and it'll be 80%, and then they'll configure some by hand. And that's not an ideal production point, but when you build in sort of dev test environments, that might be a really good way to do it. And then a customer of mine used Cloud DocKit, which is a tool that will generate documentation from that to document it. And then they had a good conversation and review against a good conversation and review of that design that came out from the as-built.
So one thing that I'd add to that as well is that when you're looking, you go think about your documentation and think about what is the value in this documentation. Like if someone comes along in 18 months' time and reads this, what are they actually going to get out of it? And it's not a table of subnets in a VNet, right? I think where design documents still have a place and are very valuable is articulating the thinking behind a decision. So, why did they go this way instead of, or even business driver, or even if there's some kind of organizational limitation or technical limitation or platform limitation that forced you down that road at that time, because you also don't want decisions becoming like scripture and never being challenged, right? If you're going, why the hell are we deploying this particular service? And you go back to the design, it's, because the new one that we actually wanted to use was in preview at the time and they weren't comfortable deploying it in production. Okay. We're past that point now. It's gone GA. We can actually maybe think of switching to it. Whereas if that justification's not there, then people would just say, no, that decision was made and this is what we use. And then it becomes unnecessarily entrenched in stone.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think just to finally close out that point, working through with customers and showing them that you could start with a high-level diagram and a drawing and showing how all the component interplay works together, see if they're willing to take that as the first iteration of the design. Then working through the detail, which I think in my mind and probably for you guys as well, is actually building and prototyping and deploying and designing it. And then when you get really mature, doing that all in code and exporting the templates out and having it all so it can be redeployed. And then it's at that point where you almost go back then to finish the document, alter it, update it. And then I think, to David's point, David Summers' comment here, it's that design and then build, test, alter, and then update the design. And then sort of, that's the as-built from there. Well, the as-built's almost generated at that point.
Yeah, that high level Visio or whatever, the diagram that articulates the way it all plugs in, that's one of the valuable parts, because that is something that you don't inherently get from the portal, is that overall map of how everything plugs in together.
Yep. Yeah. I think we had one last question as well, so we might answer that. I'll read this out. So this is from Boris Ristov. So Essential 8 seems to be an evolving topic amongst most departments and seems to be becoming more granular. Is there some guidance from MS on how cloud native capabilities can improve maturity levels? Actually, Boris, there was just an 8-part series with Mark Anderson that was out on LinkedIn, where they covered the Essential 8 in quite a lot of detail. So we can link that in here for everyone as well, and we'll put that on our website for the link to that as well. Do you guys have any comments on that one as well?
This one is not as much of a almost like a direct mapping to your Essential 8 and mapping 1, mapping 2, mapping 3 to all of your essential controls, right? Because there's a lot of cloud capability. Again, if you look at something like Azure Sentinel and Security Center, that is about your risk posture and risk mitigation and constant scanning of the environment. Now, whether those plug into Essential 8s neatly, they kind of don't. But it's more about your overall capability and and how you're managing risk, because the Essential 8 is really all about, or the ISM in general is really about managing risk and quantifying and managing risk.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I like the word maturity in that question. Essential 8 isn't, as all of the ISM is not. It's not something you can just tick off. You're going to go through, consider the things it raises, figure out whether it meets your risk profile, and then you'll have a level of maturity. It's something that increases over time with the types of things that Gareth just mentioned there. So I think. Yeah, definitely important to see it as a risk-based conversation for me when I work with teams.
Yep, agreed.
Cool. So we've got, so this is a link that you can all copy down on your notepads with your phonographs and all that other sort of stuff. So you can hit aka.ms/auazug/learn/level up. So that will take you to our list, URL list of some learning materials that are there. There's a link there for a free exam voucher as well. I believe Stu's got one of those there. So you can do one of those and earn an exam voucher for free. And some other of the learning resources that we've found quite helpful. We will continue to update that list as well over time. So we'll put that on our website. So I think one last thing we'll just mention here. So this was from Jacob Bywater, who was someone who reached out to us. So he's from Emanate Technology. We wanted to talk about some of the cloud market hiring trends. So this is available as a PDF, and we'll make this available on our website for a point in time. But yeah, so what opportunities are out there, I guess, for cloud people? So if you've come from an infra background and you want to transition to the cloud. What sort of opportunities are out there? What's happening in the market? Certainly in the ACT. So yeah, and I think with that we're at time. So thanks very much everyone for joining. I just want to thank Gareth, James for joining us here today. Thanks very much for your time, Gareth, and thank you very much, Stu.
I've actually just got one last thing, and that is the prizes we were giving out.
Oh, that's right. Can't forget the prizes. Here we go. They're on the next page.
Yeah.
Right.
So, if
I think we had exactly 5 questions, so we have exactly 5 prizes to everyone who's asked us a question. So,
yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh,
So yeah, that's easy math. Yep.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, I thought I was doing very well on the production side. We'll have to talk about the producer after this show. All right. So here's the prize. The people who won the prizes are up on the screen now. So if your name is on the screen, then please email myself and I will explain that. Government employees, you'll have to consider whether you can accept a prize. Sometimes that's an issue for you. But these are Azure passes, so you can get started, and we'll give you some credit to get started on your personal project of your choice, and you can learn about the platform. So send me an email, and I will send you details on how to use that, how to claim that prize. Cool.
Excellent. Thanks very much, team. As always, it's been a pleasure, and see you next time.
Thanks a lot for coming on, Gareth, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers. Thanks for having me, boys.
Bye.